Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on cancelled American PDWs of the post-Cold War era. That's 1991 through present. Now, PDWs, or personal defense weapons, have been around for decades, and the first PDW was designed in France in the 1930s, with the first generation of PDWs, or personal defense weapons, ending up in service in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, with weapons like the Israeli Uzi, and later weapons from the 1990s like the Belgian Fmg9, and even some newer weapons like the American Honey Badger Pdw, chambered in the .300 Blackout, and even the AR-57, which is an American personal defense weapon chambered in the 5.7 by 28mm FN, or the FN-57. But there have been many American PDWs that have been cancelled over the many decades, and in this video we're going to go over some of the modern post-Cold War era PDWs, or personal defense weapons, that were cancelled between the 1990s all the way up until now in the 2020s. So let's go over it. And the first PDW, or personal defense weapon, to be cancelled was the Colt MARS, or the Colt Mini Assault Rifle System, from 1997. In 1996 to 1997, the Colt Manufacturing Company came up with a scaled-down version of the M16A4 and A4 known as the Colt MARS, and this was an experimental light compact assault rifle based PDW that was developed between 1996 and 1997, but wasn't patented until 1998. It was chambered for an experimental cartridge, the 5.56 by 30mm Mars cartridge, which was a scaled-down version of the 5.56 by 45mm NATO cartridge already being used in the M4A4 and the M4 carbine. It fired a 50-grain projectile at a rate of about 2,500 feet per second. So it's slower than the standard 5.56, but this was meant to be a PDW, or personal defense weapon, for both soldiers and vehicle operators in both the U.S. Armed Forces, but also some security forces like the American law enforcement, for example the police and SWAT units. It was also meant to be sold on the civilian market, just like many of Colt's other rifles and pistol products. Ultimately, the project was cancelled in the year 1998. The main reason this weapon was cancelled is because Colt did not want to interrupt the success of the American M16A4 and the Colt M4 carbine, which were selling really well in the 1990s and early 2000s. In fact, the M4 carbine and M16A4 would become the standard service rifles of the U.S. Armed Forces during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. So in 1998, the project for the Colt MARS was quietly cancelled, and only 3 prototypes were completed between 1997 and 1998, and those 3 prototypes were tested by the U.S. Armed Forces and some law enforcement, although the results of those tests were never published as far as I know. The Colt MARS was an interesting weapon. In fact, it reminds me of the Cold War era Colt CAR-15, or the Carbine Assault Rifle 15, which was a scaled-down version of the M16, which was also used in the Vietnam War. So this weapon was kind of like a CAR-15 chambered for a new experimental cartridge, the 5.56 by 30mm Mars cartridge. Another cancelled PDW that appeared in the early 2000s was the Knights Armament Pdw, also known as the KAC 6mm Pdw, and this was an experimental high-powered personal defense weapon chambered in a special 6mm round. This was a 6x35mm KAC, or Knights Armament cartridge company round, and this was an experimental 6mm round that was meant to increase the stopping power while reducing the weight of the weapon. So it was a 6.5mm PDW that was meant to have the stopping power of a full-sized assault rifle while having the weight and size of a personal defense weapon, or a PDW, or a weapon that was not much heavier than a submachine gun. This weapon was chambered again for the 6x35mm KAC cartridge, or the Knights Armament Company cartridge. It was fed by a 30-round magazine and had a rate of fire of between 550 and 650 rounds per minute. Now, this was an experimental assault carbine-based Pdw, but it didn't sell very well. In fact, the only buyers of this weapon were the American Secret Service, the same Secret Service that protected the president at the time, both George W. Bush and later Barack Obama. Some of these weapons were also purchased by the CIA in very small numbers, but ultimately the project seemed to have been discontinued between the years 2012 and 2013. The Knights Armament Company Pdw seems to have gone out of service since the early 2010s, and I haven't really seen anyone talking about this weapon since at least 2014. So this is one of the experimental weapons that did go into production, and only a few hundred of these may have been sold between the years 2006 and 2012. The weapon is also known as the KAC SR635 Pdw on the civilian market, although these weapons did not sell well, and the project seems to have been cancelled between 2012 and 2013. Another more interesting weapon is the Magpul Pdr, or the Magpul Personal Defense Rifle. And this was an experimental bullpup assault carbine-based Pdw designed between 2006 and 2008. It was designed by the Magpul Industries, who are known for making magazines and some experimental or limited production rifles like the Masada, also known as the Magpul Adaptive Combat Rifle, which is a ACR type rifle chambered for the 6.5 and 5.56 caliber NATO cartridges. This weapon, the Magpul Pdr, is also chambered for the 5.56 by 45mm NATO cartridge. It is a bullpup weapon and has either a 20 to 30 round magazine. Now, this rifle was unveiled in 2006 and 2008, but ultimately the project seems to have been cancelled around 2011-2012. Now, this Magpul Pdr was designed to replace the standard 9mm handguns that were already being used by the US Armed Forces and American security forces, like the Glock pistol, for example. But ultimately, the Magpul company did not get much interest in the weapon from the U.S. Armed Forces, the U.S. Army, or the Marines, or any of the Special Forces. They did get some interest from law enforcement, but ultimately, the law enforcement in the U.S. seem to have abandoned this concept also. And the project was quietly cancelled sometime between 2011 and 2012. And there hasn't been any update on this weapon since about 2013. So the Magpul Pdr, for all intensive purposes, has probably been cancelled. And it is one of the stranger weapons, as it is a bullpup weapon, but having a standard bullpup magazine, similar to the Austrian Steyr AUG, but on a much smaller, more compact weapon. In fact, this is my favorite weapon on the list because it is the most futuristic of the early 2000s Pdw type weapons that were being tested in the US back in those days. Magpul Industries also designed a Pdw type submachine gun known as the Magpul Fmg, or the folding machine gun. And the Fmg9 was based around the standard issued Glock 18 machine pistols. Now, this was an experimental machine pistol based Pdw designed between 2008 and 2011. And actually went into very limited production until 2012. The weapon was chambered for the standard 9x19mm parabellum and was fed by either 13 to 49 round magazines and had a rate of fire of 800 to 1,200 rounds. The Fmg9, for many of you video game players, was featured in a lot of first-person shooters back in those days. For example, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. This weapon was marketed mostly towards the US government and some law enforcement agencies, and it was meant to be a compact folding submachine gun, or Pdw type submachine gun, very similar to the American Ares submachine gun or the Russian PP-90s. Based suitcase submachine guns that appeared in the 1980s and early 1990s, although those weapons also failed because no one really saw interest in a folding suitcase submachine gun even during the Cold War. The Magpul Fmg9, it was produced in limited numbers for testing, but the project seems to have been cancelled around 2012 to 2013. But ultimately the project didn't sell very well, and the project was ultimately cancelled after 2012. Which is a shame, because when I used to play video games a lot, especially Call of Duty, Modern Warfare 3, I actually did like the Magpul Fmg9 in that video game. But I always wondered how this gun would do as a standard issued submachine gun type PDW, whether it be with law enforcement or in the military. But we'll never know, as this project was quietly cancelled. And the final of the cancelled American PDWs, at least the most advanced and strange one, was the Associates Mcr, or the Modular Caseless assault rifle developed between 2005 and 2006. This was a rare experimental bullpup assault carbine type PDW developed by the Associates, which was a relatively unknown development company. They were known mostly for developing uniforms and combat gear for the U.S. Armed Forces during the years of the Afghan War and the Iraq War. But they did try their hands at developing an experimental bullpup type assault rifle PDW, the MCR. Now the MCR is an experimental bullpup assault rifle type PDW. It was chambered for a rare 6.8mm caseless cartridge. Now, if you remember, in the 1980s and 90s, the U.S. Armed Forces actually experimented with adopting caseless rifles. They experimented with various American and European designed caseless assault rifles. For example, the Austrian Steyr ACR is another example. Now, those projects all failed because the U.S. did not want to adopt a new cartridge. They wanted a weapon chambered for either the 5.56 or 7.62mm NATO cartridges. And the same seems to have happened to this MCR. It was chambered for a 6.8mm cartridge, a caseless cartridge, and the U.S. Armed Forces was not willing to change or adopt to a new cartridge. They wanted a weapon chambered in either the 5.56 or the 7.62. This weapon also had a very large magazine capacity of 45 to 50 rounds, and the rate of fire was just 800 rounds per minute. This weapon was so light and compact that you could also add a 40mm grenade launcher. So I guess this is a heavy-duty PDW. It is both a PDW type bullpup assault carbine, but it's also an advanced infantry carbine, or light carbine. The weapon was made to be extremely light, so the weapon's weight would have been around 4 to 5 pounds overall. So it would have been lighter than both the M4 carbine and the M16A4 that was already in service with the U.S. Armed Forces during the early 2000s. But this project was cancelled after 2006 and hasn't been heard of since around 2007-2008. Making the Associates MCR one of the rarest American PDWs of the early 2000s. Now, this concept could have worked if the Associate had used a standard issued cartridge like the 5.56 NATO, just like you saw in the Magpul Pdr. And I'm pretty sure the U.S. Armed Forces would have given it a chance if it was chambered for a standard issued cartridge. They would have at least experimented with it like they did with the Belgian-made SCAR-L, or the SCAR Light Automatic Carbine, or Assault Carbine, which has also been tested by the U.S. Armed Forces. Both the SCAR-L and the SCAR-H series have been used in very limited numbers by both the U.S. Armed Forces and some other NATO members. So I'm pretty sure if they had marketed this weapon in a standard issued cartridge like a 5.56 or even a 6.8mm cartridge, not a caseless cartridge, standard cartridge, the U.S. Armed Forces might have tested it and they might have liked it, but it is unknown how it would have fared against the other rifles. And ultimately, this project was cancelled after 2006. So here were some of the rare American PDWs, or personal defense weapons, that were developed in the 2000s, 2010s, and the 2020s. So which one of these were your favorite? If I had to choose, mine is clearly the final one on the list, the MCR, as that is the coolest weapon. But I also like the Magpul Pdr. That these two weapons would have served a very useful purpose in the modern era. Now, this isn't the only list on PDWs that I will do, I will also cover PDWs of the Cold War, as the US had developed a large number of personal defense weapons during the Cold War era between the 1960s and the late 1980s. But what are your thoughts on these modern PDWs that were cancelled? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.